All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the Dharma Doors. I'm MC Owens, and this is the San Francisco Dharma Collective. And tonight we've gathered together to read another sutta. So tonight, um, if you've been coming to Dharma Doors for a while, you know that we've been very slowly making our way through the Middle Length Discourses. These are sort of like the medium length teachings that the Buddha gave. Um, Last week, we concluded a little section of 10 suttas, and they were teachings that the Buddha gave to these paribhijacas, these wanderers. And what was interesting about that little group of suttas is that the Buddha was teaching the Dharma, was giving teachings to people who were not Buddhist, people who were practicing, other traditions or, other lineages. And in many of those sutras, the Buddha sort of convinced those people to come over to the Dharma in that way. So they were interesting teachings because they were sort of ways of presenting the Dharma to maybe somebody who's never heard it before, or again, to somebody of some other tradition. Tonight, we're moving on to a new section, and we're going to be reading Sutta number 81. This is the first of another group of 10 little suttas, but this little collection is called the Rajavagga, the teachings to the Rajas, to the kings. So this is going to be a different group of people, and these suttas, these 10 suttas, they're different. And what I mean by that is that if you've been coming to Dharma Doors for maybe the last, maybe, many months, maybe even the last year or more, we've been reading through the Majjhima Nikāya, and there's a certain way in which we've started to get really familiar with, well, I hope we've become, more familiar with the Dharma, with the teachings, but I feel like the suttas we've been reading now for so long, it's a particular presentation of the Dharma that usually at some point the Buddha winds up talking about the jhanas, talking about these meditative states and what constitutes real liberation and real joy and happiness. But tonight's sutra is different. And it's actually, I'm very excited. I think this is a beautiful sutta tonight. But I'm really excited to be able to share it with you because I really think this is a particular kind of sutra that you may not know what to do with it if you kind of didn't have a guide because it's so different. But I'm hoping that tonight I can kind of share with you why I think it is just such a special way of teaching the Dharma. Um, on that note, and this is not a shameless plug, this is a very like well thought out plug. But at the beginning of April, I'm gonna start a new course, and this course is going to be on Tuesday nights, and I call it the Never Ending Dharma. And that's kind of a term, of course, I've borrowed it from the famous book, The Never Ending Story, but I've kind of borrowed that term to describe a sort of almost mysticism or a magic to the sutras that if you kind of read them the right way, they can be really certainly transcendent, but even kind of mystical. And tonight is definitely a classic example of the never-ending Dharma. So in many ways, tonight is almost like a preview of this 8-week course that I'm going to be teaching in April. So if tonight's sutras interest you, if the way that I present it interests you, then you might be interested in that course. But let's get into it because it's not a long sutra, but there's a lot of moving parts. So yeah, let's just dive in. So again, this is Sutta 81. It's called the Ghaṭīkāra Sutta, or Ghaṭīkāra Sutta. And Ghaṭīkāra is a person, and Ghaṭīkāra is sort of, I would say, the star, very much the star of of the teaching tonight. Ghaṭīkāra is a potter, so he makes pots. But interestingly, the name Ghaṭīkāra means like a pot maker. And so he's Ghaṭīkāra, the Kumbhakara. And a Kumbhakara is a actual like pot maker, but a particular kind of pot. So a kumbha is a water pot or a water vessel. And you might be familiar with a very famous Indian festival that happens kind of every 12 years called the Kumbh Mela. Well, the Kumbh Mela is the festival of the water pot. And that kumbha, well, our character tonight is a Kumbhakara. So he makes water pots, but then his name is a Ghaṭīkāra, a pot maker. So he's kind of like pot maker, the pot maker in that way, kind of. So, but he's the star of the show. That can't be the Kai Cenat, so we're going to pretend that that's not the Kai. Says I doubt he's in Dharma doors. So if you could type your question, your name is suspicious in that way, Kai. Just saying. All right. So we're gonna dive in. Yeah. So, but of course, if at any point anybody would like me to stop, just raise your hand in that way. All right. So, a classic sutra. So, okay. Well, we just got started, Kai. So, if you have a really important question, please put it in the chat, and I'll make sure to work it into the Dharma talk. Otherwise, thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was wandering among the Kusalans together with a large sangha of bhikkhus. Kusala, normal place for the Buddha to be. Then the Blessed One left the main road, and at a certain place, he smiled. And it occurred to the Venerable Ananda, what is the reason? What is the cause for the Blessed One's smile? Tathagatas, Buddhas, do not smile for no reason. So Ananda arranged his upper robe on one shoulder and extending his hands in reverential salutations towards the Blessed One, he asked him, Venerable Sir, what is the reason? What is the cause for the Blessed One's smile? Tathagatas do not smile for no reason. Even before we get into why is the Buddha smiling, this is right away I have to stop us. So the thing about it is that this is something that you might just skip right past, which is the Buddha smiling. But if you read a lot of suttas, and in particular, if you read a lot of Mahayana sutras, right? The Buddha smiling is a very significant moment. And because I know a lot of you have been coming to Dharma doors for a long time, you've been here since before when we were studying the Mahayana Sutras. And we saw this happen a lot. And what it is, I would almost call it a trope. It's a repeating theme in sutras. And it's this phenomena of the Buddha smiling, and it's always Ananda. I have yet to find a sutra that it's not Ananda. And it's Ananda who says, Buddhas don't smile for no reason. The Buddha must have a reason. Now, what's interesting is what's about to happen. Like, why is the Buddha smiling here? What I want you to know, this is a point of interest. In Mahayana Buddhist sutras, I would say 9 times out of 10, in Mahayana sutras, when a Buddha smiles, the Buddha has realized that somebody is going to become a Buddha in their future life, that they've kind of achieved a certain state of cultivation or maturation, that they are irreversibly bound for Buddhahood. And so the Buddha will often in Mahayana sutras, he will give what is called a vyakaranya, a prediction of enlightenment. And so in Mahayana sutras, the Buddha smiles, and Ananda goes, "Why is the Buddha smiling? Buddhas don't smile for no reason." And asks, "Why are you smiling?" And then the Buddha says, "You see this person here? Well, in a future life, they're going to become a Buddha." But that's not what's happening here. And what's interesting is that in the Pali Canon, there's a slightly different thing that happens when the Buddha smiles. And what it is, and we're about to see it in a moment, but I kind of want to prepare you for what's about to happen. The Buddha's about to tell a story about the previous Buddha, like the Buddha before him, named Kassapa or Kassapa. And so in the Pali Canon, when the Buddha smiles and Ananda's like, "Yo, why are you smiling?" It's usually this tale of a past Buddha. But in the Mahayana Sutras, it's usually the prediction of a future Buddha. That's just something interesting to note, right? And kind of just put that in the back of your mind right now. But that's interesting. So when the Buddha smiles, and by the way, in the Mahayana Sutras, when a Buddha smiles, often like light beams come out of his smile and engulf the globe in joy. So, wild things like that happen. But here it's just a simple little paragraph. So, after Ananda asks the Blessed One, the Bhagavan, the Buddha, "Why are you smiling?" The Buddha says, "Well, once upon a time, Ananda, in this place, there was a prosperous and busy market town called Vebalinga, with many inhabitants and crowded with people. Now, at that time, the Buddha, the Blessed One Kassapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, lived near the market town Vebalinga. It was here, in fact, that the Blessed One Kassapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, had his monastery. It was here, in fact, that the Blessed One Kassapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, sat and advised the Sangha of bhikkhus. Then the Venerable Ananda folded his patchwork cloak in four, and spreading it out, he said to the Blessed One, "Then, Venerable Sir, let the Blessed One be seated. Thus, this place will have been used by two accomplished ones, fully enlightened ones." The Blessed One sat down on the seat that had been made ready and addressed the Venerable Ananda thus. But wait, we need to stop. Because there's another thing interesting going on here. So that little thing that just happened there, where Ananda said, "Oh, well, then hold on." And he folds up his robe and asks the Buddha to sit down and says, "And if you do, then two Tathagatas will have honored this place." Now, I don't want to get like too into this, but also in Mahayana Buddhist sutras, there is a very interesting trope or a very interesting theme. In particular, I mention often this really big, the flower adornment sutra, the Avatamsaka Sutra. By the way, this is just one volume of it. It's 3 volumes this big, but I didn't want to carry them over from the bookcase. In this really wild, very large Mahayana Sutra, the Buddha goes on this journey up to these heavenly realms, up to the top of Mount Meru, up to the Suyama heaven, up to the Tushita heaven. And it takes pages and pages and pages. But what happens is that when the Buddha arrives at each of these heavenly places, the king or the kind of the chief god of that realm says, "Oh, the Buddha's coming. Let me create a seat for him." And this is not just a folded patchwork robe. This is usually a magically produced throne with multiple tiers of jewels surrounded by curtains and covered with canopies. And then those gods say, once upon a time, the past Buddha so and so came to this heavenly place and sat here. Buddha, you should come and sit here. And so if you have read the Avatamsaka Sutra or you're reading it, maybe you're in my year-long study group, I want you to notice that that little part of the Mahayana Sutras, this is the original version of it, of just Ananda folding the robe, saying, "Come on, sit down, tell me a story." But in particular, it's this idea that other Buddhas have sat here. That's sort of the common theme. And if we're going to kind of really capture this whole sutra, we're going to want to keep this in mind, which is the present Buddha, past Buddha. Like, I just try to keep this in mind. And I'm going to remind you in a minute when it's going to pop up. We're going to be like, wait, which Buddha are we talking about again? Are we talking about our Buddha or the past Buddha? Well, that's actually kind of, I think, part of the magic of this type of sutra, right? It's like a shell game of Buddhas in that way. So Ananda's little invitation again becomes a trope in Mahayana Sutras. But now the Buddha tells Ananda the backstory. And oh, by the way, I didn't mention this at the beginning. The story that you're about to hear, it's also a very famous Jataka tale. And you may have heard of these. It's a whole body of Buddhist literature concerning the past lives of the Buddha. And there's many of them, like hundreds and hundreds of past live accounts. Well, the story of Ghaṭīkāra is one of the more famous of the Jataka tales. So famous, in fact, that there's like a sutra version of it. So here's that story. Here's that Jataka tale. So the Buddha tells Ananda, "Once, Ananda, in this place there was a prosperous and busy market town called Vebalinga, with many inhabitants and crowded with people. Now the Blessed One Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, lived near the market town Vebalinga. It was here, in fact, that the Blessed One Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, had his monastery, and it was here, in fact, that the Blessed One Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, sat and advised the Sangha of bhikkhus." Now, in Vebalinga, the Blessed One Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, he had as his chief supporter a potter named Ghaṭīkāra. Ghaṭīkāra had a close friend, a Brahmin named Jyotipala. Now, it says that he's a student, but he's not a student of Ghaṭīkāra. No. They're just very good friends. But Jyotipala, by the way, Jyotipala means protector or guardian of the sacred flame. Jyotipala is a Brahmin and he tends to the sacred fire and performs the sacred fire ritual. So he's a student of that tradition or that lineage. He's a Brahmin by training. Whereas Ghaṭīkāra is a potter. Now, one day, the potter, Ghaṭīkāra, addressed the Brahmin student Jyotipala thus: "My dear Jyotipala, let us go and see the Blessed One, Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened. I hold that it's good to see the Blessed One, accomplished and fully enlightened." The Brahmin student Jyotipala replied, "Enough, my dear Ghaṭīkāra. What's the use of going to see that bald, padded recluse?" Now, you need to know, and it's kind of helpful to keep this in mind, right? So a Brahmin like Jyotipala, so he's going to have those nice dreadlocks, those uncut, long, luscious dreadlocks of a Brahmin. And this is important to know that he's got these luscious dreadlocks, right? And the term that he uses, this bald padded recluse, it's an insult, all right? And actually it's an insult that's hurled a lot at the Buddhists in that way. And it's this calling them bald heads in that way. And I can't help but, if you listen to like Bob Marley music, if you listen to reggae, Bob Marley's always going off about the bald heads. I can't help but feel like there's a similar connotation there. Of course, they're different because the Buddhists are shaving their head, but that kind of negative connotation, bald heads, that's what Jyotipala says. Why would I want to go see that bald head? All right. A second time, a third time, the Pater Ghaṭīkāra said, "My dear Jyotipala, let's go see the Blessed One Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened. I hold that it's good to see the Blessed One accomplished and fully enlightened." And a second and a third time, the Brahmin student Jyotipala replied, "Enough, good dear Ghaṭīkāra. What's the use of seeing that bald head?" Ghaṭīkāra then says, "Then, my dear Jyotipala, let us take loofahs and bath powder and go to the river to bathe." "Very well," Jyotipala replied. So the Pater Ghaṭīkāra and the Brahmin student Jyotipala took loofahs and bath powder and went to the river to bathe. But then Ghaṭīkāra said to Jyotipala, "Ooh, my dear Jyotipala, there is the monastery of the Blessed Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened, quite nearby. Like, ooh, we happen to be right here, right? Let us go and see the Blessed One, Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened. I hold that it's good to see the Blessed One, accomplished and fully enlightened." Jyotipala replied, "Enough, my dear Ghaṭīkāra. What's the use of going to see that bald head?" A second and a third time, Ghaṭīkāra said, "My dear Jyotipala, there's the monastery of the Blessed One Kasyapa right here." And a second and a third time, the Brahmin student Jyotipala replied, "Enough, my dear Ghaṭīkāra. What's the use of going to see that bald head?" Then the Pater Ghaṭīkāra seized the Brahmin student Jyotipala by the belt, pulled him in, and said to him, "My dear Jyotipala, there is the monastery of the Blessed One, Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened right here. Let's go and see the Blessed One, Kasyapa, accomplished and fully enlightened. I hold that it's good to see the Blessed One accomplished and fully enlightened." Then the Brahmin student Jyotipala undid his belt and said, "Enough, my dear Ghaṭīkāra. What's the use of going to see that bald head?" Then, when the Brahmin student Jyotipala had washed his head, the Pater Ghaṭīkāra seized him by the hair. Now, even if you don't know anything about Indian culture, you would already know that that's like pretty wild. But if you know about Indian culture, you need to know something very important. A Brahmin, like Jyotipala, in terms of the caste system of India at that time, a Brahmin was much higher than a meager pot maker. So these two people, although they're good friends, they're of two different castes. So even in a way, touching somebody else's head is like, that's kind of a bold move. To touch somebody's head right after they've washed their hair and their head, that's like even worse. And then this idea that a lower class person is grabbing the freshly washed head of a Brahmin, this is wild. All right. So Jhatikara seizes Jyotipala by the head, by the hair, and says, "My dear Jyotipala, there's the monastery of the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, quite nearby. Let us go and see the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened. I hold that it's good to see the Blessed One accomplished and fully enlightened." Then the Brahmin student Jyotipala thought, "It is wonderful. It's marvelous that this potter, Jhatikara, who is of an inferior birth, should presume to seize me by the hair when we have washed our heads. Surely this can be no simple matter." And he said to the potter Jhatikara, "You go as far as this, my dear Jhatikara?" "I go as far as this, my dear Jyotipala, for so much do I hold that it is good to see the Blessed One, accomplished and fully enlightened." "Then, my dear Jhatikara, let go of me and let us go visit him." So, so Ghaṭīkāra, the potter, and Jyotipala, the Brahmin student, went to the Blessed One, Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened. Ghaṭīkāra, after paying homage to him, sat down at one side while Jyotipala exchanged greetings with him. And when this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he too sat down at one side. Ghaṭīkāra then said to the Blessed One, Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, "Venerable Sir, this is the Brahmin student Jyotipala, my friend, my close friend. Let the Blessed One teach him the Dharma." Then the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, instructed, urged, roused, and gladdened Ghaṭīkāra the potter and Jyotipala the Brahmin student with an exposition of the Dharma. At the conclusion of that exposition, having delighted and rejoiced in the Blessed One Kashyapya's words, they rose from their seats, and after paying homage to the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, keeping him on their right, they departed. That's another moment that we can't skip past too quickly. So in Dharma doors, late, like the last many, many months, years even, I don't know if we've ever seen this happen. And what I'm talking about is a reference to a Dharma talk that we don't hear. But there's another famous sutra that does that. In fact, it's kind of, in many ways, if you've ever heard of the Lotus Sutra, another very large Mahayana sutra, this sutra is interestingly very famous for the Buddha. Well, I shouldn't say the Buddha, but for the sutra telling us that the Buddha gives these teachings, but we never hear what they are. And in many ways, if you are into Mahayana sutras, if you're into the Lotus Sutra at all, again, this is a very big sutra, but one of the weirdest, wildest things about it's why people trip out on the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is weird because it keeps, like, if you read it, it keeps talking about how the Buddha is going to teach the Lotus Sutra. And like everybody's very excited that the Buddha's going to teach the Lotus Sutra. And you're like, wow, I can't wait for the Buddha to teach the Lotus Sutra. This is going to be crazy. And then pretty soon, they start talking in the past tense about how the Buddha taught the Lotus Sutra. And you're like, did I miss it? Like, where was the Lotus Sutra? And so the Lotus Sutra is a really weird teaching or sutra because it seemingly never happens. But, or is that the sutra? Well, I want you to know that basically, by as far as I can tell, this little Ghaṭīkāra, the Potter Sutra, is like a mini Lotus Sutra inside the Pali Canon. So what I'm getting at is that there's a lot of parallels between the Lotus Sutra and this type of sutra. And one of the weird things that happen is this, and then the Buddha gave a Dharma teaching. But the thing about it is, and this is where I actually find the organization of the Majjhima Nikāya, I find it really interesting because we've been reading these sutras and we started at number 1. I've skipped a few, over the months, but we've been reading it straight through. And basically, if you were like a good, sutra student or a good Dharma student, at this point in the collection, you know what a Dharma talk is. You've heard it. This is what I was saying before. Like you know how it goes. You know about the jhanas, you know about the teachings. So that it's an interesting moment in the collection where it can basically not even tell you the Dharma talk and just presume that you know what Kashyapya taught or like the gist of what he taught. But wait, it keeps going. It keeps getting weirder that in this really weird way where you're going to wonder like, wait, where's the sutra here? So a very interesting parallel to the Lotus Sutra is this description of Dharma talks that don't actually get described. But afterwards, so I'm at the very bottom there, paragraph 11, afterwards, then Jyotipala asked Ghaṭīkāra. So the Brahmin student asks Ghaṭīkāra, now that you've heard this Dharma, my dear Ghaṭīkāra, why don't you go forth from the home life into homelessness? So why don't you become a monk? And Ghaṭīkāra says, oh, my dear Jyotipala, don't you know that I support my blind and aged parents? Jyotipala then says, well then, my dear Ghaṭīkāra, I shall go forth from the home life into homelessness. And this is a very important moment here. Jyotipala renouncing. I'll tell you why later. So, hold on one sec. All right. So, Ghaṭīkāra the potter and Jyotipala the Brahmin student then went back to the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened. After paying homage to him, they sat down at one side, and Ghaṭīkāra the potter said to the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, "Venerable Sir, this is the Brahmin student Jyotipala, my friend, my close friend. Let the Blessed One give him the going forth." And the Brahmin student Jyotipala received the going forth from the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, and he received the full ordination of a monastic. Then, not long after Jyotipala, the Brahmin student, had received the full admission, a half a month after he had received the full admission, the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, having stayed at Vebalinga as long as he chose, set out to wander towards Benares, or Varanasi. Wandering by stages, he eventually arrived at Benares, and there he went to live at the deer park at Ishipatana, which, if you don't remember, that's where the Buddha gave his very first teaching, the turning the Dharma wheel teaching, right, to the 5 bhikkhus. And boom, that concludes the first part of the teaching. So we are introduced to Ghaṭīkāra Jyotipala. For a long time, Jyotipala doesn't want to go see that bald head, but then he finally is convinced by Ghaṭīkāra's devotion. And that's going to be kind of the key element of this sutra for kind of to understand the rest of it, is that Jyotipala was sort of convinced by Ghaṭīkāra's devotion, that he was willing to go that far, right? Oh, wow, you'll go as far as that to grab my head? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to go that far. And he was impressed by that, and then listened to the Dharma, and then renounced. So that's the first part of the teaching. Now, at that time, King Kiki, or Kiki of Kasi, had heard, it seems that the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, has reached Benares and is living in the deer park at Ishipatana. And by the way, if you were wondering, I thought you said this was the Rajavagga. I thought you said this was the collection of sutras to kings. Well, King Kiki is our king. So that's how this sutra gets lumped into this category. So King Kiki hears that Kashyapya's in town, and so he has a number of state carriages made ready, and mounting a state carriage, he drove out from Benares with the full pomp of royalty in order to see the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened. He went thus as far as the road was passable for carriages, and then he got down from his carriage and went forward on foot to the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened. After paying homage to him, he sat down at one side, and the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, instructed, urged, roused, and gladdened King Kiki of Kasi with an exposition on the Dharma. We don't know what he said, but at the conclusion of the exposition, King Kiki of Kasi said, "Venerable Sir, let the Blessed One, together with the Sangha of bhikkhus, consent to accept tomorrow's meal from me." And the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, accepted in silence. Then, knowing that the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, had accepted, the king rose from his seat, and after paying homage to him, keeping him on his right, he departed. Then, when the night had ended, King Kiki of Kasi had good food of various kinds prepared in his own dwelling, red rice stored in the sheaf, with the dark grains, the bad dark grains all picked out, along with many sauces and curries. And he had the time announced to the Blessed One Kashapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, thus: "It is time, venerable sir. The meal is ready." Then, it being morning, the Blessed One Kashapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, dressed, and taking his bowl and outer robe, he went with the Sangha of bhikkhus to the dwelling of King Kiki of Kasi, and sat down on the seat that had been made ready. Then, with his own hands, King Kiki of Kasi served and satisfied the Sangha of bhikkhus, headed by the Buddha with the various kinds of good food. When the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, had eaten and had put his bowl aside, King Kiki of Kasi took a low seat, sat down at one side, and said, "Venerable sir, let the Blessed One accept from me a residence for the rainy season retreat in Benares. There will be such service to the Sangha." "Enough, king," said the Buddha. "My residence for the rain season has already been provided for." The king thought, "The blessed Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, does not accept from me a residence for the rains in Benares." And the king was very disappointed and sad. Then he said, "Venerable sir, have you a better supporter than I am?" And the Buddha said, "I have, great king. There is a market town called Vebalinga, where a potter named Ghaṭīkāra lives. He is my supporter, my chief supporter. Now, you, great king, you just thought, the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, does not accept from me a residence for the rains in Benares. And you were very disappointed and sad. But the Pater Ghaṭīkāra is not and will not be so. The Pater Ghaṭīkāra has gone for refuge to the Buddha, to the Dharma, to the Sangha. He abstains from killing living beings. He abstains from taking what has not been given. He abstains from misconduct and sensual pleasures. He abstains from false speech. He abstains from wine, liquor, and intoxicants, which are the basis of negligence. He has unwavering confidence in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and he possesses the virtues loved by the noble ones. He is free from doubt about suffering. He's free from doubt about the origin of suffering, about the cessation of suffering, and about the way leading to the cessation of suffering. He eats only one meal a day. He observes celibacy. He is virtuous, of good character. He's laid aside and in a way doesn't touch gems and gold. He's given up gold and silver. He does not dig the ground for clay with a pick or with his own hands. Nope. Only what has broken off from riverbanks or is thrown up by rats. Only that he brings home in a carrier. When he has made a pot, he says, "Let anyone who likes set down some selected rice or selected beans or selected lentils, and let them take whatever they like." He supports his blind and aged parents. Having destroyed the 5 lower fetters, he is one who will reappear spontaneously in the pure abodes, and there he will attain final nirvana without ever returning from that world. All right, I'm going to pause there. I want to talk a little bit about Ghaṭīkāra here. Yeah, so this is sort of where we're getting into like the teaching of the sutra in that way. But it's again, the teaching's happening in a very interesting way, right? So it's happening in this kind of story mode, right? And so I just want to spend a little bit of time because this is sort of part of what makes this sutra sort of very well known and well respected is actually this description of Ghaṭīkāra as like an ideal householder in that way, right? So you have that little exchange with Jyotipala about, hey, why don't we both go become monks? And he's like, well, I take care of my blind and aged parents. So he's a householder in that way. But this description of his life is, that he's basically as monastic as you can get while still being a householder and he has a craft. But what a lot of people make a big deal of in referencing this sutra, they make a very big deal of the idea that it's a Buddhist virtue to not, I guess, be capitalist, but it's like a Buddhist virtue to not be in this kind of quid pro quo exchange, especially exchange for money or gold or silver. And so a lot of people make a big deal of this almost barter honor system that Ghaṭīkāra has going on, where he just makes his pots, puts them out, and then people leave food and take whatever they want. And it's again, it's kind of an honor system and there's no money involved. So people make a big deal out of that. Um, because I haven't paused for a little bit. Any questions so far about what's going on? Yeah, no.
I have a question about when King Kiki invites the previous Buddha to have dinner or whatever, a meal with him.
Yep.
Doesn't that sort of break the rule of begging and does he do that on purpose to kind of because it seems like he's in the middle of telling him why he's not his primary student and Ghaṭīkāra is, but why how can Buddhas can't really do that, right? Monks can't do that. They can't go to someone's house for dinner like pre-planned, right?
They can and they do, but it is a point of contention. And in fact, if you recall or um, Devadatta, so Devadatta is the Buddha's like a cousin of the Buddha, and Devadatta is like he's as historical as all the rest of these people, but Devadatta actually he he's famous or infamous, I should say, for attempting to create schisms in the Sangha. And he actually, the story is he actually tried to kill the Buddha on several occasions in order to take over the Sangha. And one of Devadatta's point of contentions was exactly what Noam just brought up, which is this the Buddha and others going to pre invited um, meals in that way. So you're right, Noam, that like it's not that simple, meaning that there was a debate at the time, seemingly at the time of the Buddha, if not afterwards, there was a debate about whether this was cool or not. Now, I think it goes very much without saying that the Buddha thought it was cool because the Buddha did it often. And we have sort of a lot of stories of other monks and nuns also going to prearranged meals. I hear you though. It does sort of like it pushes up a little bit against the idea of begging, or not the begging so much as the kind of receiving leftovers. Whereas this sounds like no, the king had a meal made for the Buddha. And that's a contentious point. But what we need to know, or I think what we need to think about, was when the first time Devadatta went to the Buddha and said, "Hey, we shouldn't be doing this. We shouldn't be um, accepting meals like that. We should be begging for them every day." The Buddha's answer was, "Yeah, if you want to do that, you should do that. If you don't want to go to planned meals, yeah, you shouldn't do it." And he says, "And anybody else," because this was like a meeting of the Sangha. And he was like, "Yeah, and anybody else who thinks that that's not cool, yeah, you shouldn't do it then." Which is a great answer. Which is like, yeah, if you have a problem with it, don't do it. Now, the Buddha had his reasons for doing it, like for accepting it. And basically, what I want to point out is that Devadatta, he actually had a bunch of grievances, and they all were basically like, how could I summarize? Devadatta was like, "We're not hardcore enough." It's basically what he was saying. Like, we're not hardcore enough. We started sleeping under roofs. Devadatta was like, "No more roofs, trees, no more pre-planned meals, begging only." And Devadatta had a list. He was almost kind of like a kind of a Buddhist Martin Luther, where he had his little list of theses where he was like, "No more, no more this, no more that." And that's when the Buddha got everybody together and he said, "Yeah, if you all want to do this, you should." And the Devadatta's list, those become known as the Dahuta austerities. And actually, I believe the word Dahuta just means austere. But the Buddha said, "Yeah, that's like, if anybody wants to be hardcore, yeah, that's the way to be hardcore. So if you're into being hardcore, follow these rules." But what he didn't say was everybody has to follow those rules. So I hope that's a kind of a fair answer, Noam.
That's a great answer, and thank you so much. It's fascinating. And I just want to make a couple of comments, which you don't need to respond to just because I'm taking up a lot of time. But one is about, since we've recently, you and I referenced some old sutras have been talking about whether, Buddhists should eat meat or not. And one of the sort of clauses, or the outs, was that, yeah, if someone's got some leftover meat that they didn't finish and they give them to monks. Did I say Buddhas? I meant monks. That that's okay, but you can't. A monk can't eat meat that was prepared for them purposely, and so that's kind of, I'm a little conflating those two things here, and we don't know what King Kiki fed him. But then the other part is that it just seems like there's the larger pieces, there's just potential for, I'm just going to use the word corruption, just sort of like, people like buttering up the monks, or the monks, getting favors because they have an in. So those are just my comments, but
Mhm.
your answer was very helpful and appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, Noam, and your thoughts about it are right on point, especially regarding those rules that definitely no meat was to be prepared for the monastics, but indeed leftover meat in the early days was considered okay. We do hear that it's like this really nice red rice with curries, so no meat is mentioned in that way. Um, yeah, I'm gonna resist going off on a tangent about all the diet stuff. Yeah. But thanks for that, Noam. Noe, did you have a comment question?
Just really quick, in the last talk with the wanderers, this was addressed as, "Oh, I see that your followers only eat a little bit," and the Buddha's response is elegant. It's like, some of them eat less than I do. So
Exactly.
it was more about the wisdom of it, the
Yep.
Dharma of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and Noe, on that note, I will say one more thing in response to Noam's question, comment, and your comment. My feeling about like my feeling about the Buddhist thinking, who knows, but I I see the like how can I put it quickly? The quickest way I can kind of express this idea is that there were and are a lot of more austere meditation traditions in India, and they didn't make it out of India and change the world quite like Buddhism has. And I actually think the Buddha's wisdom of accepting these kind of invitations was about an upaya of being able to spread the Dharma. And because he did it that way, we're here talking about this. So I kind of think that that's part of it. And also the wisdom of him saying, yeah, and if you want to do that, go do it. Like, so, yeah. All right. But let's keep going because we still have really the heart of the sutra to get to. But before that, because I don't, mm, yeah, we don't have that much to go. Hold on one second. So, because I don't know if I'll have total time to do this at the end, I want to do a little. I just want us to think about this really quickly. And I was even going to go into more depth about this, but I'll give you the medium version. So I want us to think about this for a second. So every Buddhist sutra, every single one of them, begins with the phrase, "Thus have I heard." And if you know your Buddhist kind of history or your folklore, you know that after the Buddha died, 500 of the arhats all got together for what's called the first council. And at the first council, the arhats decided what the vinaya was, what the monastic rules were. And there was one monk there named Upali, who was like king monastic discipline. And then there was a body of kind of philosophical literature called the Abhidharma, and Shariputra supposedly repeated what the Buddha had taught regarding the Abhidharma. And then there was Ananda, the Buddha's young cousin. And there's a funny story about how he actually wasn't an arhat yet, but on the evening of the first council, he became an arhat. And so he went to the council and was like, "Hey guys, I made it. Like, let me in." And they were like, "No, you didn't make it. Like, the meeting's closed." So Ananda, in order to prove that he had become an arhat, he shrunk himself down and jumped through a little knothole in the door and then expanded his body. And all the other arhats were like, "Whoa, you are an arhat." But the story is that it was Ananda who heard every single teaching the Buddha gave. And then at the first council, Ananda recited every single teaching that the Buddha had given. And he started every single sutra by saying, "Well, thus have I, Ananda, heard that one time the Buddha was in such and such a place with such and such a people," and so on. So, what I want you to think about is this. I'm telling you about Ananda telling us about the time the Buddha told Ananda, "But wait a minute, isn't Ananda the one that's telling us all this to begin with?" Never mind that. I'm telling you about Ananda telling us about the Buddha telling Ananda about Kashyapya telling the Dharma to Jyotipala. or Ghaṭīkāra. Do you see the levels of recursion, as it would be called, where there's like a story within a story within a story within a story, and I'm telling you that story. So there's this kind of meta recursion happening. And I just want to draw your attention to that subtle, like, because any sutra has a couple of layers, because it's going to be, thus have I heard the Buddha was in such and such a place, and he said this to the audience. But these kinds of sutras, where the Buddha's telling a story, it gets weird because of this recursion. And it's even weirder when you keep in mind that the thus have I heard is referring to Ananda, right? So it's like, thus have I heard, one time me and the Buddha were walking, and the Buddha told me about the previous Buddha. Anyways, I just want you to kind of, from a kind of storytelling point of view, I just want you to notice all of those levels of recursion. All right, so I didn't know when else I was going to be able to mention all of that. So, but let's get to the juicy part of the sutta. So Kashyapya, the previous Buddha, just got done telling the king about why his primary supporter is Ghaṭīkāra, because he's so virtuous, he runs his business the way he runs his business, and he's basically almost an arhat. He's that accomplished in his practice. In fact, and now I'm on paragraph 19, so the Buddha tells the king, in fact, on one occasion, when I was living at Vebalinga, it being morning, I dressed, and taking my bowl and outer robe, I went to the Pater Ghaṭīkāra's parents and asked them, "Where has the potter gone, please?" "Oh, venerable sir, your supporter has gone out. But please, take rice from the cauldron and sauce from the saucepan and eat." Kashyapya says, "I did so and went away." Then the Pater Ghaṭīkāra went to his parents and asked, "Who's taken rice from the cauldron and sauce from the saucepan, eaten and gone away?" "Oh, my dear, the blessed Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, did." Then the Pater Ghaṭīkāra thought, "Oh, it is a great gain for me. It is a great gain for me that the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, has so much trust in me." And rapture and happiness never left him for a half a month, or his parents for a week. On another occasion, when I was living at Vebalinga, it being morning, I dressed, and taking my bowl and outer robe, I went to the Pater Ghaṭīkāra parents and asked, "Where has the potter gone, please?" "Oh, venerable sir, your supporter's gone out. But please take porridge from the vessel and sauce from the saucepan and eat." I did so and went away. And then the Pater Ghaṭīkāra went to his parents and asked, "Who's taken porridge from my vessel and sauce from the saucepan, eaten and gone away?" "Oh, my dear, the blessed Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, did." Then the Pater Ghaṭīkāra thought, "It is a gain for me. It is a great gain for me that the blessed Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, has so much trust in me." And rapture and happiness never left him for half a month, or his parents for a week. And then on another occasion, when I was living at Vebalinga, my hut started leaking. Then I addressed the bhikkhus thus, "Go, bhikkhus, and find out if there's any grass at the Pater Ghaṭīkāra's house." "Venerable sir, there is no grass at the Pater Ghaṭīkāra's house. There is the grass thatch over his workshop, though." "Go, bhikkhus, and remove the grass from the potter Ghaṭīkāra's workshop. They did so. Then the potter Ghaṭīkāra's parents asked the bhikkhus, "Who's removing the grass from the workshop?" "Sister," they replied, "the hut of the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, is leaking." "Oh, then take it, venerable sirs, take it, dear ones." Then the potter Ghaṭīkāra went to his parents and asked, "Who's removed the grass from the workshop?" And the bhikkhus did, my dear. "The hut of the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, is leaking." Then the potter Ghaṭīkāra thought, "It is a gain for me. It is a great gain for me that the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, has such trust in me." And the rapture and happiness never left him for half a month, or his parents for a week. Then that workshop remained 3 whole months with the sky for a roof, and yet no rain ever came in. Such is the potter Ghaṭīkāra. After hearing all of that, the king Kiki replied, "It is a gain for the potter Ghaṭīkāra. It is a great gain for him that the Blessed One Kashyapya, accomplished and fully enlightened, relies upon him so." Then King Kiki of Kasi dispatched to the potter Ghaṭīkāra 500 cartloads of red rice stored in the sheath, and also sauce materials to go with it. Then the king's men went to the potter Ghaṭīkāra and told him, "Venerable sir, there are 500 cartloads of red rice stored in the sheaf, and also sauce materials to go with it, dispatched to you by King Kiki of Kasi. Please accept them." But Ghaṭīkāra replies, "The king is very busy and has so much to do. I have enough. Let all of this be for the king, or be for the king himself." So basically, he sent it all back. And now, the big reveal. And now, Ananda, you might be thinking this way. Certainly someone else was that Brahmin student Jyotipala on that occasion, but it should not be regarded thus. It was me! I was the Brahmin student Jyotipala on that occasion. That is what the Blessed One said. The Venerable Nanda was satisfied and delighted in the Blessed One's words. All right. So by the way, what happened at the end there, that kind of little reveal that actually that whole time, Jyotipala was actually, that was the Buddha. But it was a past life of the Buddha. Remember, I told you this is a famous Jataka tale. So this is the famous kind of Jataka tale of the time that the Buddha was this kind of arrogant Brahmin student that didn't think that he needed to go see the Buddha. But being convinced by Ghaṭīkāra, the Brahmin, the arrogant Brahmin with his wild dreadlocks, goes to see the Buddha, is convinced by the Dharma, and renounces. And this, of course, is of vital importance for the Buddha to eventually become Shakyamuni, Gautama Buddha in that way. So what you need to know, or what I would like you to know, is that this is also a trope, if you will. It's a thing, it's a theme that gets repeated in many sutras. And what it is, it's this very, I mean, I haven't seen it anywhere else, so I considered it a very Buddhist storytelling technique. And it's this thing of telling you this whole story, and then at the end, there's this reveal. Now, in the Pali Canon, it is normally, in fact, I can't really off the top of my head think of any that are not revealing that this was a previous life of the Buddha. But what I want you to know is that in these Mahayana sutras, in particular, big old Mahayana sutras like the Avatamsaka Sutra, they use this trope a lot. The Buddha tells, you know, these long, elaborate backstories, and then we'll conclude the story by saying, and you know what? At that time, so and so, that was you. And so was that person. And that was me. So it becomes this whole, like, I don't even know. It's like I guess I would call it a form of dramaturgy, right? A kind of form of drama that is, again, it's very unique to these Buddhist sutras. In fact, once again, if you've read the Lotus Sutra begins with one of these, where there's these two bodhisattvas, Maitreya and Manjushri. And if you haven't read the Lotus Sutra, basically it starts with the Buddha shooting light out of his forehead, and Maitreya, who's a bodhisattva, is like, "Whoa, why is there light coming out of the Buddha's head?" And Manjushri says, "Oh, you don't remember?" And Maitreya says, "Remember what?" And he says, "Oh, eons and eons and eons and eons ago, there was a Buddha named Sun Moon Bright. And that Buddha emitted a light. And when that Buddha emitted a light, he taught the Lotus Sutra. Don't you remember? Because at that time, you were Bodhisattva so and so, and I was Bodhisattva so and so, and we were there. You don't remember?" So there's this thing that starts to happen in the Mahayana Sutras where, again, it's not just the Buddha, it's like everybody was involved in these past dramas. And you start to, especially if you read the Lotus Sutra, you start to kind of fall into this, like, I don't know how else to put it besides the never-ending Dharma in that way, but you kind of fall into what, what Nietzsche might call this eternal return idea, that all of this has already happened before, you just forgot. And so what I'm getting at is that there's a really weird way, especially of reading the Mahayana Sutras, that, yeah, Maria, that they just really, they have a way of almost bending time or folding time in on itself. And the main thing that I kind of want you to know or think about, again, it's not about knowing. It starts to happen to me, and maybe it's just because I recite these sutras so much. It's the really, like, subtle thing about pronouns. In particular, like when you've been reading like this sutra that we read tonight, at a certain point, when it gets repetitive, and then it's like on another occasion, when I was living at Vebalinga, and there's a way in which you can kind of slip into the role of the I in that way. Like, I don't know how else to explain it in that way, but, and again, it happens to me a lot as a person that recites these, because I'm saying this first person pronoun all the time. And it almost starts to, like, affect me in that way. And it's why I encourage people to read and even chant and recite sutras, because you can kind of have a slightly mystical experience that way. But what I'm kind of getting at with this is I kind of already mentioned it. Where's the Dharma talk? Right? I mean, I know that you know what the Dharma talk is, right? Because it's about Ghaṭīkāra being this very virtuous householder. He's even basically more noble than this king, more noble than the Brahmin, even though he's a lowly pot maker, right? But he's of the Buddha holds him in the highest esteem. That's a Dharma talk all by itself, right there, right? But there's this other thing going on with these like more story sutras where I really do feel like the story and especially the recursion I was talking about, those layers of recursion, I really feel like they are designed to draw you really deeply into the story, so much so that you feel like you are kind of there in a way. And again, this is what I'm kind of referring to as this never-ending Dharma in that way. So, by the way, because I don't want to forget, there's a term, and I've never mentioned this term. It's called an itivritika. So if you're out there, you want to write this down, it's an I-T-I-V, so the R with the little dot underneath, T-T-A-K-A, Vittiritika. And the Vittiritika, or Itivritika, is the name for that, like, that reveal of, and guess what? I was that Brahmin. So there's a name for that, like, revelation twist at the end, and it's called this Itivritika. And so in Mahayana sutras, you will even sometimes see like the Itivritika of King Prasanajit or somebody. And so it's this past life story of somebody. And again, the main thing that I was attempting to do tonight is I really wanted to share with everybody how a sutra like this contains so many of these little elements that basically become the foundation of these Mahayana sutras. And I'm always super excited to find these kind of sutras because this is basically like a Mahayana sutra. Or, you know, or I guess the way I could put it is if you found this sutra in a Mahayana collection, it would fit in perfectly. You would not be surprised in that way. So, a lot of these things, like a lot of these wild things that happen in Mahayana sutras, I'm always trying to share with everybody that they have precedent in the Pali Canon. And in many ways, the Mahayana Sutra is just taking these little tropes, as I'm calling them, and just going further with them in that way. So, all right, questions, comments, ideas, insights? Yeah, Noe, please.
When you're referring to the Flower Sutra and the Mahayana Sutra, if I recall, these were later with the Chinese, or am I wrong?
You are not quite correct in that they are not Chinese creations.
Right.
No, they're from India, and they are some of them are in Sanskrit, but for the tech, you know, if anybody out there is like really technical about this stuff, you should know that there's a whole language. It's not Pali, which is that early kind of dialect of southern India that the teachings are preserved in like Sri Lanka, over in Myanmar, in Cambodia. So there's that Pali language. And then there's the very sophisticated Sanskrit language of northern India. But what you should know is that the majority of Mahayana sutras are all preserved in a language that we call Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. And it is a language all by itself, and it is a language that is exclusively a Buddhist language. It's why it's called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. And basically what it is, it's a form of Sanskrit exclusively used by Buddhists that basically uses Pali grammar and a bunch of kind of Pali words. And that's where you get the hybrid part. So it's Sanskrit, but it's not Sanskrit. It's not Pali, but it's Pali based. And so it's this weird hybrid language. So that's what a lot of the Mahayana sutras are written in Noe. And then that is what is taken to China and translated into Chinese. The main reason, though, that somebody like me, for example, the main reason why I use and translate Chinese, it's not because these things were written in Chinese. It's actually because the oldest records of these things are in Chinese. So if you can read Chinese in that way, you can really have access to the oldest versions, but always keep in mind that they are originally coming from India, for sure. With the exception of a few apocrypha, of course. So,
Thank you, Michael.
yeah, thanks, Noe.
Will
Thank you
that
for
be
indulging me.
well? And this will be part of the classes coming
Yes.
up.
Yes.
Excellent. I'm intrigued.
Yeah. And on that note, Noe mentioned I'm teaching 2 classes in April. The Never Ending Dharma, which is a sutra, like a mega sutra study course. That's on Tuesday nights, 6:30 to 8. And then on Saturday mornings, starting in April, I'm teaching a class that I call the 8 Schools of Buddhism. And it's basically a survey of all the different kinds of Buddhism in the world today and where they come from. So, and like what teachings make them unique, but it's also a class about how they're all Buddhism. So the commonalities and differences between all the different schools of Buddhism. So that's the 8 schools, Saturday mornings, 9 to 10:30, or a kind of Buddhist literature class or a sutra class on Tuesday nights. So thanks, Noe. Any other questions, comments, or ideas about the sutra, Dharma in general? Noe?
Wow. This man is what is his name? The potter's name is
Ghaṭīkāra.
Ghaṭīkāra, and there's that little story of the potter who goes down. Ghaṭīkāra. I'll just call him Ghaṭīkāra, and he has 2 pots on a pole on ropes, and he fills them with water, and the one pot is broken. You know this one? And the broken pot says, "Why do you carry me? I'm broken. I leak water. I'm no good to you. Just throw me away." And Ghaṭīkāra says nothing. And as he walks back up the hill, he says to the broken pot, "Look at all the flowers because you're leaking your water. The water's been leaking." It's a beautiful little story, but thank you for reminding me of that. This reminded me of that too.
That's a lovely story to end on. All right, everybody. That's it for me. We're going to keep going in the Rajavaga section, in the section on the kings next week. So probably Sutta 82, probably. But we'll find out next Sunday.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Noam.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you being here so much.
Everybody, great to see you.
Have a lovely night.